Every pattern has an origin. In this episode, I'm going to take you to a dining room I sat in as a child and show you where I first saw a pattern I have been carrying my entire life. I'm Stephen Rohde. I work with men who are ready to stop repeating the patterns that have been running their lives. This is Course Correction. Before we get started, it is important for you to understand that this work is hard. It is some of the hardest work a man can do, and most men find they cannot navigate it alone. Not because they lack the capacity, but because the nature of this terrain is that these currents run beneath the surface. You cannot always feel them until you are already in them. If what you are about to hear moves you, I can help. Reach out to me directly at yourcoretruths.com. Last episode, I shared a story about an afternoon in my son's closet doorway and a mirror. I told you about a pattern running through me before I had any conscious say in it, about a shudder I recognized in my son because I had felt it in my own body as a boy, in rooms not so different from that one. I told you that what the mirror showed me that afternoon was not his mess. It was mine. That is what this episode is about. I was probably 7, maybe 8 years old. My father was an architect and had designed and built a house for my grandparents, his parents. The house had been recently completed, and we were sitting in their new dining room eating dinner. All of a sudden, my grandfather starts listing off all of the things wrong with the house. He wasn't speaking as someone who was grateful, not as a father receiving something his son had built for him. No, he was a man going through a punch list of what had been missed, what still needed fixing, and what should have been handled differently. He was speaking to my father the way someone speaks to a contractor who has fallen short of the job. He was speaking as a dissatisfied customer. My father tried to answer him. He tried offering explanations. He provided reasoning. He tried to give context for the decisions that had been made. My grandfather would only listen to a few words and then wave it off and return to his list, and then wave off the next explanation, each dismissal shorter than the last, more final. I watched my father's face as this happened. I remember seeing the tension gather in his jaw and his eyes becoming hard, his shoulders raised slightly toward his neck, bracing. I was watching a man who was trying very hard to stay even, stay in control, while something underneath was pulling him in the opposite direction. His voice began to change, not from anger at first, but from something more urgent than anger. He was trying to be heard. He needed to matter. There was an almost pleading desperation in his tone. Then, before I knew what was happening, the room erupted. I sat there, 7 years old, watching my grandfather and my father yell at each other, red-faced, with what I can only describe now as disgust and hatred. The argument was not about the house. It was never about the house. Finally, my grandmother said one word: enough. It wasn't so much of a resolution, but rather a lid being placed back on what could not be spoken, could not be seen, could not be heard, pushed back to where these things lived in that family. Underground, unacknowledged, silent, buried but not gone, never gone. We left shortly after. My father said goodbye to my grandmother, and we walked out without saying goodbye to my grandfather. I remember saying goodbye to my grandmother and searching her eyes for understanding, for safety, for something that might explain what had just happened and what was I supposed to do with it. All I saw was sort of a sad uncertainty. The drive home was about 40 minutes. No one said anything. I remember my brother and I looking at each other wide-eyed. 2 boys in the back seat, exchanging the only question either of us had. What do we do with this? Neither of us had an answer. I realize now that my father had built his father a house, but what we just witnessed was the proof that his father never gave him a home. The pressure that was in that dining room did not stay there. That is what unprocessed pain does. It does not disappear. It relocates. It moves to the next available place and sets up residence there. It had been coming home with us for a long time. It showed up in how order was maintained in our house and what happened when it wasn't, in the particular weight that certain silences carried and what those silences were asking everyone in the room to do. We learned early how to read the temperature. More importantly, we learned what happened when we read it wrong. Some of us learned to fight it. Some of us learned to run from it. Some of us learned to become experts at reading it, to watch, to adjust, to become whatever the room needed in order to stay safe in it. I was the one who watched. I watched what happened around me, and I learned what the room rewarded and what it punished. I learned to read the temperature before it peaked, to adjust my behavior before the situation required it. I got very good at it. What I was doing has a name. It is what behavioral scientists call the Fawn Response. Most people know 3 of the 4 survival responses the nervous system can deploy under threat: fight, flight, and freeze. The 4th is fawn. It is the one that looks like compliance from the outside, the one that looks like an agreeable kid, an easy kid, a kid who doesn't cause problems. It was not easy. In fact, it was sophisticated because it required reading another person's emotional state in real time, anticipating what they needed and providing it before the situation escalated. That is not weakness. That is social awareness operating in a child who had no other tools available to him. The strategy worked. It worked very well. And that is exactly why it has stayed with me. I have carried it into every room I have entered after that, into friendships, into relationships, into work, into fatherhood. The same skill that kept me safe as a boy kept running in contexts where safety was no longer the question. Long after I had left the rooms that built it, my nervous system was still stuck in it. What I just described has a name. It's called intergenerational trauma, sometimes called transgenerational trauma or inherited trauma. It is the transmission of trauma responses from one generation to the next. It is a precise mechanism. We parent from the nervous system and the patterns we formed in childhood, the ways of responding to threat, the things we learned to do to survive the rooms we had to live in. We become the environment we create for the people who come after us, our children. This is not intentional. It's through the automatic operation of unexamined patterns running exactly the way they were built to run, to keep us safe. Before I go further, I want to speak directly to the man who's deciding this does not apply to him. Intergenerational trauma is not reserved for the most extreme experiences. It does not require violence or abandonment or catastrophe. It does not require that your childhood was obviously horrible, or that you can point to a single defining event and say, that's it, that's where it happened. It requires only that something traumatic happened in the chain before you and went unexamined long enough to become the water you swam in as a child. It might have been the environment, or the strained temperature of the room, or the thing everyone in the house understood without naming. If you grew up in a house that had a temperature like the one I just described, you know exactly what I mean by that. Then what I am describing is in the room with you right now. Dr. Gabor Mate, a physician and trauma researcher whose work has been foundational for me, frames it this way. The question is never whether a parent loved their child. It is what the parent was carrying with them that the child now has to navigate. What was being passed forward in my family was something neither my grandfather nor my father could see clearly enough to stop. That's not because love was absent. It's because the pattern was invisible to both of them. That is the nature of what moves through families unexamined. It doesn't feel like a pattern. It just feels like the way things are and always have been. Psychiatrist Dr. Judith Herman established the clinical framework for understanding chronic relational trauma, such as what we are talking about. She documented precisely what happens when a child grows up navigating what I sat through at that dinner table that night. The sustained relational stress of a family system carrying pain it cannot name. The nervous system of that child does not emerge from that environment unchanged. It adapts. It learns and builds responses. And those learned responses, exactly like my fawn response, exactly like the pattern that ran through me in my son's closet doorway, become the operating system the next generation inherits. That is what connects my grandparents' dining room to my son's closet. That is the mechanism Herman's work names. We will build on it in the next episode when we go deeper into what that operating system looks like and why it cannot simply be switched off by deciding to be different. For now, what matters is this. You did not make this up. This is real. It has been documented and been studied. It has been named. And it does not belong to you. I want you to feel the scale of what we are talking about. Intergenerational trauma does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a warning. It moves quietly from one generation to the next, gathering power and size as it goes. Think of it like the Colorado River that began as many small streams trickling down different mountains into the watershed. Each stream is modest on its own, unremarkable, but then they combine, growing in power, size, and force. And as they grow, they do not just move, they carve. The water now begins to erode the land beneath it, slowly, persistently, invisibly, until somewhere downstream you look up and realize you are now standing at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. The water didn't choose to carve that canyon. It only followed the path available to it, the path of least resistance. In my family, that path was silence. But everyone born into that canyon learns to navigate its walls as if they were just the way the world was. It is important for you to understand that what I am saying is not an accusation of the people who came before us, not of my father or yours, not of my mother or yours, not of anyone in the chain who passed something traumatic forward without knowing they were doing it. Also, this pattern does not travel through only one parent. It moves through the whole family system, through what each parent carried into the house, through how those things combined, and through the specific atmosphere that combination created. It travels through every branch, the whole environment a child grows up inside. My grandfather was not a villain. He was almost certainly a man who never received from his own father what he needed, and had no map for how to give it. My father was not a villain either. He was a son who spent his life reaching to be seen, to be heard, to be valued. And that reaching shaped the environment he created in our home, without his knowing it, without his choosing it. Every person in the chain was carrying something they did not choose. My father and my grandfather both are gone now. Please know that what I am sharing here, I would have said directly to them. Their absence is not what makes this possible. This work is what makes this possible. This is not absolution, it is accuracy, and accuracy is what makes it possible to look at what we received, to really look at it without the defensiveness, without blame, without emotional collapse, and without shame. This is not a prosecution of our parents. It is the process of seeing the pattern for what it is, not as personal failings, but as inheritance. Those are very different things. If this pattern is so deeply embedded, so invisibly woven into how a family operates, so automatic, so thoroughly mistaken for normal, then you might ask, how does it ever stop? That is the question underneath everything I have been saying, and it is the right question. The cycle ends when someone can finally see it clearly enough to stop passing it forward. Now that sentence obviously sounds simple, and we both know that it is not. Because what the cycle has always relied on is exactly the thing that makes it so hard to see. The fact that what you inherited feels like you. The Fawn Response does not feel like a survival strategy I developed in childhood. It feels like my personality. The tension and temperature of the room does not feel like trauma. It feels like normal. The canyon does not feel like something that was carved. It just feels like the landscape. Finally seeing it clearly enough means something specific. It is not a concept or a general intention. It is a moment. It is an action. In my son's closet doorway that day, I saw what had arrived in me from somewhere upstream. I did not manufacture it. I inherited it. It had been moving through my family chain for longer than I have been alive. And in the moment I saw my son protecting himself from me, in the moment I understood what I was actually witnessing, something in the chain had a chance to stop. That clarity is the beginning of the possibility of the end. As I said before, it is important to understand that this work is difficult to manage alone. This is where a guide can help, because knowing you are standing in a canyon is not the same as knowing how to navigate it. The strongest currents in the water run beneath the surface. You can't typically feel them because you already are in them. Think of how a river guide doesn't make the river less powerful. They know where it goes because they have run it before. They can see what you cannot see because you are inside the current. That is what this work asks for. A guide, me or someone else who does this work, but someone who knows these rivers and this terrain. If what you are hearing today feels like your story and you seek guidance through it, please contact me at yourcoretruths.com. This is the legacy of trauma, a pattern that travels quietly from one generation to the next, unannounced, unexamined, gathering force the way water gathers it, carving the canyon that the next generation is born into, and mistakes for the just being the world. It goes unnoticed because it does not feel like a wound. It feels like your personality, or just how the way things are and always have been. And because it feels like the way things are, it runs automatically in every room that reminds the nervous system of the one where it was first built. When I saw my son raise his hands in that closet doorway without knowing it, he was showing me the pattern. He was showing me that he was learning to create and raise a shield to protect himself. We will talk about that shield. We're going to spend real time on it because understanding what it is and why it formed is one of the most important things this work asks of us. But before we can understand the shield, we have to understand the canyon it was built inside. That is what this episode was. See it for what it is. This week, I'm asking you to do one thing. Think of one pattern in your life that you have been trying to change, something that keeps returning no matter how many times you address it, something that feels older than the circumstances that trigger it. Now, trace it upstream one generation, not to assign blame, not to explain yourself or excuse yourself, just to ask, where might this have lived before it lived in me? What did the rooms I grew up in teach me about how to handle this? You do not need to have the answer. The question is enough. So sit with it. What you are looking for is not a verdict. It is the beginning of understanding that the pattern is not original to you. That understanding is the first thing that makes it possible to change. The house was already built long before you arrived. If what you are hearing today feels like your story and you seek guidance through it, you are exactly who I work with. And please, if you know someone who needs to hear this, send it to them. Reach me at yourcoretruths.com. I'm Stephen Rohde. This is Course Correction.